Hey guys, Kevin here. I wanted to share with you a new development with the podcast. It is coming to you from a new podcast hosting service, Anchor.fm. So far, I'm really impressed. I really like it. Number one, it's free, which is always great. It's also integrated with Spotify and offers some great analytics on who's listening, helps me gain some insight into what content would be good for the audience. And you can also record from your phone, which is a nice new feature that I'm using right now. So if you have a podcast or you're interested in starting one, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of Can't Make This Up. I'm your host, Kevin. I'm very glad to have you today. I hope you're all settling into fall, which is upon us. Football's back on TV. Oktoberfest is in the stores. Pumpkin spice lattes at Starbucks. The weather's getting cooler. For a lot of people, this is their favorite season of the year. If you're one of them, congratulations. If you're a summer person like me, we kind of hate the rest of you. Today's episode, we're doing something that I've wanted to do for a while, but haven't been able to find the right book. We're going to be talking a little bit about Indigenous history. We're going to look at some history from the perspective of Native Americans. My author today is, my guest is Mark Lee Gardner. He is a historian of the American West, and he joins me to talk about his recent book, The Earth is All That Lasts: Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and the Last Stand of the Great Sioux Nation. Mark is an authority on the American West. He's been writing on it for well over a decade. He's worked with the National Park Service out west. He's a regular contributor to several series such as PBS American Experience, the Travel Channel, BBC, and so forth, to comment on the history of the American West. So he has a lot of interesting things to share with us about the history in Wyoming and confrontations between the expanding United States and the indigenous peoples who call the West their home. Of course, if you are new to the podcast, just checking us out for the first time, thank you so much for being here. If you've listened to a few episodes and you like it, please do me a favor. Please like this, subscribe to it on whatever you're listening to. Please leave a review and rate it. That's incredibly helpful. I can't tell you how helpful that is. And then if you want to follow me on social media, I'm on most of the platforms at CMTU History. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, whatever. And then if you want to follow the show on YouTube, it's available there as well for people who like to listen via YouTube. All right, well, on to my interview with Mark Lee Gardner.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
You are listening to Can't Make This Up. I'm your host, Kevin, and I'm joined today by Mark Gardner. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing great, Kevin. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Well, thanks for taking the time to join us. If you'd be so kind, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an independent author and historian. My interests are the Trans-Mississippi West, and it's been that way since I've been a child. I was born and raised in Missouri, in Jesse James country, and then moved out here into Colorado to marry my lovely wife in the early 1980s. And I've been doing all kinds of work. Previously did some writings for the National Park Service, some of their guidebooks at different Western historic sites, and started doing these really big books about 10 years ago. It started with a dual biography of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett called To Hell on a Fast Horse.
That's a good name for a biography.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of deal with topics there in the mountain regions in the middle west of the country.
Yeah, everything, really, Kevin, I kind of look west of the Mississippi is fair game for me. And like I said, since I was a kid, that's something that's always interested me. My father, like I said, I was born and raised in Missouri. My father was a logger, an independent logger. He went out and cut maples and oaks and walnuts, and he had a sawmill along a little blacktop road north of the town where I grew up in, and for a while anyway. And so, but he always made sure in the summer to take at least a week or two off, and he would take the family, my mom and my two sisters, on a vacation. And we probably hit every Western fort, museum, historic site, from Jesse James' home in St. Joe where he was killed to the Little Bighorn battlefield. So I think that definitely instilled in me a sense of the past and of these really fascinating, larger than life people that lived in the places where I lived, even in Missouri and elsewhere. And I've been kind of hung up on these historical figures ever since.
This gives me a lot of hope because I drag my kids to historic sites and the national parks, and they don't seem to be interested all the time. But this gives me hope that maybe that'll change when they get older.
I think it will. I mean, I do think it rubs off. My my parents collected antiques, and my dad was a huge collector of Indian arrowheads, and he would take us kids out in the spring when the farmers got the fields ready to plant, and we'd go out after a rain and look for flint chips and arrowheads. And so, yeah, we were really history oriented. I mean, they hit all kinds of antique farm auctions too, and that again, it's like those tangible things that you can touch. I mean, antique, something that was over 100 years old, and there's just a fascination with historical objects, and they were into all of that stuff, and I am too.
Well, here you are today. You're writing history books, and the one we're going to talk about today is your most recent, "The Earth is All That Lasts: Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and the Last Stand of the Great Sioux Nation." First thing I wanted to ask you is, first, what does your title mean? That's an interesting title. And then you've kind of written a dual biography here from a Native American perspective. Did that present any research challenges?
Yes. Well, so your first question, and Kevin, you're not the first one to ask this question, but the Earth is all that lasts was like you would call it a rallying cry. When warriors went into battle, whether it's against Euro Americans or other native nations, leaders would shout things like "Hoka which means "come on." Today is a good day to die. The earth is all that lasts, and the point of this being is that you're not going to live forever. Our time on this place is limited, so sell your lives dearly, protect our families, protect our children. Only the earth lasts. You're not going to last forever. So in fact, one of the quotes I use in the book from Luther's Standing Bear was the words of wisdom given from a father to his son. And he said, "Son, I never want to see you grow up to be an old man. I want you to die on the battlefield. That's the way a Lakota dies." So again, the earth is all that lasts. Today is a good day to die. Brave up. These are rallying cries to instill bravery and valor amongst their fellow warriors. Now, your second question about the challenges of writing on another culture and attempting to tell their story from their perspective were immense. I had to immerse myself in all the Lakota literature and touching various aspects, whether it was religion, politics, social. And fortunately, there's a lot of that literature out there. Scholars have been studying the Lakotas, and I should say that Lakotas have been studying the Lakotas. It's not just white scholars, but Lakotas, there's also good books by Lakota historians as well, that have recorded their culture and their history. But probably my biggest, the thing that helped me the most in bridging that cultural divide were the actual oral histories that were taken with people that knew Sitting Bull, that were related to Sitting Bull, people that were related and knew Crazy Horse. In fact, I made it a point, I did not interview living Lakotas because I wanted to talk, I wanted to use resources, primary sources of those who actually knew these men and who were eyewitnesses to some of their feats. And fortunately, there's really a lot of those out there. Some of these early historians and anthropologists in the late 1920s and early 1930s interviewed these living Lakotas, both women and men, extensively. In fact, one author, Walter Campbell, who went by the pen name Stanley Vestal, he went up to the Standing Rock reservations, the Cheyenne River reservation, and interviewed Sitting Bull's nephews, One Bull and White Bull, and also many other aged Lakotas. And all his notebooks have been preserved. They're at the University of Oklahoma, and even better, they've been digitized. So you, Kevin, could go online, and if I cite a certain interview, you can go and double check me and look at.
Well, good. It sounds like you've had quite a treasure trove of resources and documents to bridge the gap between modern American culture and then Lakota culture.
Yes, fortunately so. Also, another thing that today's historians have access to that they didn't, 20 years ago is this technology that allows us access to millions of pages of 19th century newspapers. There are now at least 4 or 5 websites devoted to the scanning and posting of these historic newspapers. And so I found a number of interviews with Lakota warriors who fought in various fights, including, of course, the Little Bighorn, and that were published in some obscure newspapers that previously you would have had no clue that these things existed. But because you can search these newspapers, like I said, I found several accounts and letters also from soldiers in some of these encounters, because they would write a letter home, and then their relative would take it to the paper, and the paper would put, "Hey, I got this thing from my son, Lieutenant so and so, and it's about this battle up on the Yellowstone." And so so it was really fun to be able to discover some of this new information that added to the story.
That's great. That's a lot of fun. That's great. All right. Well, then what can you tell us about the Lakota people and the Sioux Nation?
Well, the Lakota Nation itself, I think what fascinates me most is this really dynamic and challenging era for them of the 19th century. It was a time where their culture would just blossomed. And I'm speaking of the horse culture. They hadn't had the horses forever. The horses were introduced by the Spaniards, and eventually Lakotas traded and for horses and captured horses. But before the horse, they traveled on foot. They had dogs that helped pack their meager belongings, and they raised small patches of crops. But the horse changed everything for them, like it did lots of these northern nations, or these Great Plains nations, I should say. And it allowed them to cover vast distances, and now they could follow the buffalo herds. And wherever the buffalo went, they could move their camps, and many of their clothing, their lodging depended on the buffalo. Their lodges were made out of buffalo hide. Their tools were made from bones of buffalo, and so it all revolved around this buffalo culture. And so it was like I said, it was a period in the 19th century where it really had blossomed and come into a really beautiful thing. But at the same time, the Lakotas are faced with their their greatest threat, and that's the encroachment of Euro-Americans, who you've got Lewis and Clark, going up 1802, up the Missouri, and of course they meet these various tribes, and they see the Lakotas, and the Lakotas are full horsebound people by this time. But then within just years, we see a flood of Euro-Americans going across into the plains. At first, it's just traders, and the Lakotas are good with that because they're getting things, manufactured items that they can use if they want, whether it's glass beads made in Italy or brass kettles that they can use for cooking, scarlet wool blankets, those kinds of things they wanted to trade for, and they often welcomed traders. But when we started getting Oregon Trail travelers, and a real flood of people with the discovery of gold in California, well, those people that are going across what became known as the Great Platte River Road, they're killing buffalo that the Lakotas are using to feed their people, as well as the hides that they can use for trade. That impacts their lives, and it's just a domino effect after that. More and more whites mean more and more conflict and fighting to maintain their homeland, which occupies most of the latter half of the 19th century, trying to stop that tide. And Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull emerge as the two most prominent leaders who are against any accommodations. They're against treaties. They're against reservations. They want to maintain what is theirs, and they want to maintain that culture. And it was a tremendous challenge that they tried to meet.
So let's talk about them a little bit more. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. I mean, when you read like an American history textbook, they kind of conveniently show up just before the Battle of Little Bighorn, and then conveniently leave a few paragraphs later. Tell us a little bit about who these two individuals were as people.
Yes, and I'll tell you, I had studied this time period and what was happening in the Northern Plains quite a bit, but in the course of my research, I learned a lot, and I discovered that I didn't know as much as I thought I did. And one of the things I found fascinating about Sitting Bull, and it goes to your point, we usually just read about him in connection with the Little Bighorn. Now, he was at that time considered an old man chief. He was 45 years old, and he wasn't expected to fight. He was a holy man and their leader of the various groups that were camped there. But his career began as a warrior, and he had many famous encounters and fights. They call them, he had many coups. Okay, so you can get a coup by touching an enemy, by killing an enemy, by capturing a female of another tribe, capturing a horse. He had many coups. He was a ferocious fighter. And we just don't picture Sitting Bull in that way because all the photos we have of him were made after his surrender, right? Or most of them anyway. So he doesn't look like this fearsome warrior, but he was. And that's how you rose within the political structure of the Lakotas and the various bands, was through your feats and through your bravery. And it was especially important if you weren't the son of a chief, which Sitting Bull was not, and neither was Crazy Horse. So if you're not hereditary, then you have to be even more, you have to be demonstrative of your abilities and your bravery even more to get to those levels within the Lakota Nation. So Sitting Bull earned every step, war chief, supreme chief, he earned all those different levels. And that was something that I wasn't really that familiar with, and because I never really pictured him that way. Mm-hmm. He was born about 1831. Crazy Horse is born about 9 years later. Sitting Bull's the Hunkpapa sub-tribe. Crazy Horse is Oglala, but of course they're all Lakotas. And Crazy Horse, he is I'm trying to think of the right word to use. To a lot of people, even his own people, he was peculiar in some ways, and it included his physical appearance. He was light-skinned, and more than one person commented that knew Crazy Horse that he resembled someone of mixed heritage. They called him in the 19th century mixed bloods. From all we know, his parents were both Lakotas, but it was unusual, just an unusual light skin color that set him apart. And his hair was different. His hair was curly. And in fact, his early nickname was Curly because of his hair. So those things kind of set him apart, his physical appearance, but also his personality. He was very reserved. He was modest. As an adult and as a leader, he did not like to speak at council meetings. And, it's really hard as a biographer, and it was hard for people at the time to understand his true essence. And I've said, and I've written that sometimes it seems like the only time he showed real emotion was on the battlefield. I mean, he was the ultimate warrior. He had several horses shot out from under him, which was, when you hear people say that, they say the same thing about Custer in the Civil War, and it was true. It's like Custer had several horses. That's indicative of his bravery, the fact that he's out there in front. The Crows said about Crazy Horse, says, we know Crazy Horse. We always saw him before we saw anybody else. He was always in the front. It was easy for us to recognize him. So, like I said, he was the ultimate warrior. He was, in that way, he was charismatic, at the same time mysterious, and he attracted men to him that wanted to be led, that wanted to follow him. And again, he did not have a chief as a father. He gained his prestige through his own actions on the battlefield.
And so what kind of relationship was there between the two?
According to the nephews of Sitting Bull, they were friends. We don't have a lot of words directly from Crazy Horse. As I mentioned, he didn't speak a lot, didn't like to talk in council meetings, and he never really talked to any whites because he didn't go to treaty councils. There was one source that we have who lived in the camps. His name was Frank Guard, and he lived in Sitting Bull's camps and Crazy Horse's camp, became good friends with both. So we do have some insights from them. But as far as we know, from the available sources, they were friends, and it makes perfect sense because Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse really both had the same goals, and they were exactly to protect their homeland and their people against white encroachment. I mean, they were violently opposed to accommodating the whites. And like I said, they never touched the pen. That was the phrase used by Lakotas because most of them, I mean, they didn't know how to sign their name in English, so they would just make an X or a mark, and they called it touching the pen. Well, neither Crazy Horse nor Sitting Bull ever touched the pen. So they were allies, but in addition to being allies, they were also friends, at least according to Sitting Bull's nephews, who were close to both those individuals.
So as the growing United States expands westward and the Lakota leaders begin to see this as a threat to their livelihood, what's the first conflict between the Lakota and the U.S. Army, I guess, which they called the Bluecoats?
Yes.
And what effect did that have on these leaders?
Well, probably the first really serious conflict. It happens on the Great Platte River Road, or the Oregon, also the Oregon-California Trail. And I mentioned earlier about this flood of immigrants. And this flood of immigrants brings lots of encounters, and most of them, there's no consequences. You could call them peaceful. But in 1854, there was an incident over, of all things, a cow. It was a Mormon cow that apparently had strayed from a wagon train. There was a large Lakota village nearby, and they find this cow and they butcher it. I guess the owner goes back to find his cow and discovers that the Lakotas have killed it. And he complains at Fort Laramie, and there's a small military garrison there. And unfortunately, there's a young a lieutenant named Grattan, fresh out of West Point, who's just itching to fight Indians. And the commanding officer makes a very poor choice in sending him and a detachment of about 29 soldiers to go and retrieve, or to go, to punish the individuals who took this cow, right? When they get there, this Grattan is just so obnoxious. He doesn't listen. There's an interpreter there, and he's demanding to have the culprits who took the cow and killed it. And the leader is insulted, offended, and they weren't even part of his band. So he really couldn't give up these individuals anyway. And he offered to pay for the cow or trade. And the lieutenant was having nothing of it, and just escalated until the warriors are gathering and gunfire breaks out. And the result is that this excitable lieutenant is killed, and every one of his men with him. And after that, the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, is intent on punishing the Lakotas. And really, from 1854, there are interludes of peace, but it's essentially one violent confrontation after another for several decades, actually.
How would you characterize this period? I mean, I guess we would call it the Indian Wars. What is the nature of this conflict?
Part of it is the U.S. government wants to, their goal is to keep open these travel corridors. So we have the Oregon-California Trail. So we have, a military post. But when gold is discovered in various places in the West, then that brings hordes more of Euro-Americans. So gold is discovered in Montana and Idaho. And all of a sudden we have a rush of people. They're going up the Missouri River to Fort Benton, but then they discover a cross-country route from the region of Fort Laramie, and it's known as the Bozeman Cutoff. So you have all this traffic. Well, once you have all these Euro-Americans going across this area, then you have the U.S. government starting to build more military posts in Lakota land. I mean, this is their hunting grounds. This is their territory. And it was territory that was agreed by the U.S. government in a former treaty to be theirs. And so we have violent encounters, because they're so opposed to these forts. They don't want these forts there. So a lot of the conflict is kind of hit and run tactics, hitting a wagon train that's not well guarded, hitting a small military detachment. In 1866, the Lakotas are really harassing a new post named Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming, just south of present-day Sheridan, Wyoming. And they lure a detachment of men away from the garrison, a man named Fetterman, and about 81 soldiers, both infantry and cavalry, and they annihilate every one of them. And nearly 2,000 warriors are able to ambush, essentially, Fetterman and this detachment of both cavalry and infantry, 81 men, and annihilate them. And this is part of what's known today as the, quote, Red Cloud War, because the Lakota war chief Red Cloud was heavily involved in this fighting to force these soldier forts to close down. And eventually, this war results in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, where the U.S. government does actually abandon these forts. But it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory, because there's this thing called the railroad. They don't necessarily need to use the Bozeman Cutoff, because these steel rails after the Civil War are rolling along westward, and which allows more opportunities for Euro-Americans to come across the West and into Lakota lands, and to kill Lakota buffalo, use Lakota resources. So the forts were abandoned. Red Cloud touches the pin, but the clock is ticking, essentially. And then we have another gold discovery, and that's in the Black Hills in the 1870s, which brings hordes more. And this Black Hills discovery leads to this ultimate conflict on the Little Bighorn River. The whole reason that this fight occurs is that holdouts like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who wouldn't sign a treaty, the U.S. government Ulysses Grant's administration, they decide, even though the Lakotas are abiding by the treaty and are residing on Lakota land, they're going to force them onto the reservation, or they're going to kill them, and then they're going to get them to sign the treaty. So they send these military columns. It's a three-pronged approach or strategy into the northern plains, and the whole goal is to defeat Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and their people, as well as these other anti-treaty leaders, and force them onto the Great Sioux Reservation, and then negotiate a treaty. So the Black Hills starts that, because the Black Hills were part of the Lakotas' lands by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 that Red Cloud signed. But the U.S. government decided it's just too hard to keep these miners out of there. There's too much clamoring from Western settlers to open this up. And so they're going to use the military to force these Lakotas to come to terms and eventually agree to abandon those hunting grounds in the Powder River country.
Now, one thing that I found interesting in the book was that there were these in United States society. There were these, I guess what we would call them, more progressive alternative ideas with how to approach the Lakota assimilation and acculturation.
Oh,
what they might not seem progressive today, but
well, Grant, this goes back to Grant's peace policy. It was called the peace policy. The Grant administration thought, or this was their plan, if they could get the Lakotas, and it's not just the Lakotas, but other native nations, to remain on very fixed boundaries of a reservation, they would use humanitarian organizations, both religious, non-religious, to go about assimilating. And another word you find quite frequently in the literature is civilizing. Most Euro-Americans thought the only way to, quote, save the Indian was to civilize him, to make him a white man. And that meant, essentially it's cultural genocide, erasing everything about their culture. So their kids are going to be sent to boarding schools. They're going to be forbidden to speak their native language. In fact, the Indian Bureau, their hard and fast policy, you will not be allowed to teach them their native language in the schools. It has to be English. They outlawed several religious practices that were key to Lakota culture, like the sun dance, for example. This was considered by Euro-Americans, quote, paganism. And so the sun dance was outlawed. Really keep them on the reservation, teach them to be farmers, teach them to be white men, erase all vestiges of their traditional culture. And the Lakotas that went along with that idea were, as the word you use, were termed progressives. The Lakotas who did not go along with that, like Sitting Bull, were non-progressives and troublemakers. So that was the idea. Fortunately, very fortunately, that plan did not succeed entirely, and the Lakotas were able to maintain their language and their culture to this day. But the Indian Bureau did their hardest to make that happen. Now, I will say, Kevin, one of the interesting things that occurs through this process of acculturation, assimilation, some of these young students that are sent to the boarding schools, one of them is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, because they learn English and learn to read and write English, they become these very important cultural intermediaries. And one of them is Luther Standing Bear. And in the late 20s and early 30s, he wrote 2 or 3 books. One's called Land of the Spotted Eagle. Another is called My People, the Sioux. And he teaches us about not only the way they lived prior to the white man, but also about their everyday lives and how they looked at the world. One thing that Luther Standing Bear talked about that I found very interesting, and it's about visions, and seeking a vision was very important to the growth of young warriors to become a warrior. You needed a vision, and that helped with your war medicine. That it would help the holy man prepare things that would protect you in battle. And anyway, Luther Standing Bear said how white men scoffed at these notions that you could have a vision, or that you could get a message on the wind, or that you might have, or you might talk to a bird like Sitting Bull did, or Sitting Bull's father got a message and heard something and understood that a buffalo was speaking to him, a bull buffalo. And he says, we were closer to nature than the white man, and they just don't understand, and they didn't. And in my book, I don't question those events or incidents. If Sitting Bull had an encounter with an eagle and something was shared with him, and Sitting Bull tells his story, it's not my place to question what happened. I wasn't there, and I include those different vignettes in the book because it's part of his story, and it's part of what made Sitting Bull who he was. It's what made those visions, or what made Crazy Horse who he was. Crazy Horse was
for him.
Yeah, he was guided throughout his life by these visions.
Well, if people want to learn more about the climax of your book, which occurs around the 1870s, they can of course pick up a copy. But one of the last things that I wanted to ask you is, how is this period remembered today among descendants of the Lakota?
Well, I think they're very proud of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. These two leaders serve as inspiration. For example, they were inspiration during the Wounded Knee takeover in 1973, which is a long time ago now, right? During the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse serve as inspiration because these individuals resisted to the very end. Their insistence on protecting their people and their culture, and true leaders of Lakotas, they live for their people. One of the virtues of Lakotas was generosity and endurance and wisdom, and they truly lived and died for their people. So the Lakotas today can thank Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull for fighting for their cultural survival, and I think they're very proud because, like I said, they're mentioned and they are inspiring for current protest, for social justice, and for, again, protecting their sacred land, which that Dakota Access Pipeline ties exactly into. I mean, that's what Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were fighting for in the 1870s, was to protect their land and their people.
In the exact same place.
In the exact same place, yes.
Well, Mark, I really enjoyed talking to you about this, and I really enjoyed your book. I think it's a really important piece to look at part of American history, but from the other perspective. So if people want to learn more about the Indian Wars and the Great Sioux War, and pick up a copy of your book, where can they go?
They can go to their favorite bookseller. There's a page, harpercollins.com has a page devoted to my book, and you can hit links wherever you want to order it, whatever your favorite retailer is. You can even go to your local independent store, and many bookstores are carrying it. And if they don't, you can have them order it for you. So it's pretty much out there everywhere. You just go to that harpercollins.com.
And what about you? Do you have a website as well?
I do. My website is songofthewest.com, and I'm happy to answer emails. In fact, there's a page on there where people can contact me directly, and I welcome that because I like to hear from readers, and it helps me as a writer as well to hear comments, and for my next book, I can hopefully incorporate some of the things that people noticed or found. By the way, my next book is a dual biography of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday.
Okay, I was gonna add, that was gonna be my next question, if there were anything coming down the pipe.
Yeah, everybody, we all know that they were friends, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't really know, well, how did that friendship start, and what exactly was that relationship? They were such different individuals in their demeanor. And of course, they were made famous by movies, whether it was Tombstone or Gunfight at the OK Corral. So we all know that they were friends, but no author has really gotten deep into that friendship. And so I hope, and it'll be a dual. I mean, I'll trace both their careers like I did with the Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and they do interconnect, just like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And so I just started the research on it. I've been to Tombstone a few times, and so yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into that. And it shouldn't take me 5 years. This book took 5 years because, I mean, as we pointed at the beginning, I mean, that culture was completely foreign to me, and so I had to do a lot of learning. So hopefully the Doc and Wyatt won't take quite as long.
Okay, well, hopefully maybe we'll have you on again when that one comes out.
Great, I'd love to do it.
Great. All right. Well, Mark, thank you again for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, Kevin. Let's do it again.
Hi, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned a little bit about this piece of Western American history from a Native American perspective. Big thank you to all the listeners for checking out this episode. Big thank you to Mark Gardner for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and you want to pick up a copy of The Earth is All That Lasts, there is a link for it down in the description of this episode on your podcast app, wherever you're listening to this. And then Mark was kind enough to take an extra couple minutes to answer a bonus question, and that's available over on the show's Patreon page. Looking forward to what else is around the bend here in fall. Next week, I'll be speaking with Catherine Stewart, who's written a book on the history of the rise of religious nationalism, which is something that has kind of come to the forefront in American politics. And so I've gotten a little curious about where that comes from, and Catherine is able to provide us a little bit of history. After that, getting into October, it's getting to be Halloween. Creepy things are upon us. And so I will be talking with a historical fiction novelist. Her name is Kim Taylor Blakemore, and she has written a novel called The Deception, which takes place during the spiritualist movement of the mid to late 19th century. And so her protagonist is a medium who communicates with the dead. And while this is a novel, this was a real movement, and it was a very popular trend in the 1800s. So very excited to talk to her. And then looking a little bit further afield, there's nothing set in stone. I've got a couple feelers out for a couple books related to the history of movies. And then there's one potentially about espionage during World War II that I'm pretty excited about, but still got to finalize things there. So thank you again for sticking with me for another episode, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.